Hello and welcome to 101 Code. My name is Moaz Nashawi and this is the Open Specification crash course. In this course, we're going to describe first what is OpenAPI Specification version 3.0 and why do we need it. Then we're going to get some hands-on basic structure and annotation and syntax of OpenAPI Specification. We will do that by implementing the OpenAPI dependency and annotation in Java Spring Boot application. And by the end of this project, we will be able to build an API with a Swagger UI and OpenAPI specification implemented in Spring Boot. And finally, we will demonstrate some benefits of having an OpenAPI specification document with other API tools like Postman, for example. So without any further ado, let's get started. So let's start with the OpenAPI Specification Definition, or OOS. What is OOS? OOS defines a standard, language-agnostic interface to RESTful API, which allow both humans and computers to discover and understand the capabilities of the service without access to source code, or access to documentation, or through network traffic inspection. When properly defined, a consumer can understand and interact with the remote service with a minimal amount of implementation logic. In order to understand this definition, we need to ask ourselves why we need to apply this specification in our API. Imagine you will have a document which describes the whole API, disregards the programming language it's built in. So basically, if you have a Spring Boot application with a REST API and you apply this OpenAPI specification standards, you can extract a JSON file, for example, which contain all the information of your API and all the responses, all the tags, everything. You can use this document, for example, to generate the code or the boilerplate code for your API in different programming language like Node.js. Also, you can use this document to benefit a large set of OpenAPI compatible tools like a Postman. So basically, you apply standards, you extract those standards, and those standards are readable by all the API tools or any API tools OpenAPI compatible, and you can benefit a large set of those. I will show an example at the end. Also, the ability to have your API routing operation built in different programming language with a click of the button. As we said, and as I mentioned above, you will have one document. You can use this document to do a lot of stuff. We will get to that in this course. Okay, now how we will cover this subject or this crash course. There are two main ways to create an OpenAPI specification. The first one, it's by using the Swagger editor to build JSON or YAML file, then use Swagger code generator to create a boilerplate code with your preferred code language for both backend or frontend. So basically, this is the first approach. We open a website, it's a swagger.io. We use the editor over there to start building the schema and building the YAML file or JSON file of the OpenAPI specification. Then we generate the boilerplate code for your preferred code language. The second way is to implement the OpenAPI library dependency in your project. Whether you're using, for example, Java or Node, there is like a dependency for the OpenAPI. You can implement it in your project, and then you start to write the Swagger or OpenAPI annotation and start to document and build your API. We're gonna go with the second approach in here in this course. And by that, I mean we're gonna have a Spring Boot application with some controllers and web dependency. We're gonna add the OpenAPI dependency to this project, and we're gonna start to apply and write Swagger and OpenAPI annotation and those endpoint to describe it. Now, this is like, I'm showing you now the final result of this course. We're going to have this kind of project, and we're going to have also the Swagger user interface implemented. So basically, this is the project. We're going to have it here. We're going to have endpoints, described endpoints here with everything, parameters or request body or responses. So this is the final result of this course. And worth to mention, this project or this repository is uploaded to GitHub. You can find the final result in the final branch And in the main branch, you will find the starter project. So you can download it to start working with this course. So enough with theory, let's start to build the code. So let's start. In order for us to start applying the OpenAPI Swagger specification on a Spring Boot application, for sure we're gonna need a Spring Boot application with web and dependency inside of it. So here I have prepared a GitHub repository which has a Spring Boot application and only a web and dependency inside of it. We're gonna download it, and I'm gonna open, let's unzip it. Now I have this object project. Let me open my IntelliJ. I'm using IntelliJ. You can use whatever IDE you want. File, open. And from open, we can go to the project and hit open. You can see here we have a normal Spring Boot application. Here as a POM XML, we only have the starter web and dependency. And I have defined some of controllers, post mapping controllers for create to do and delete delete to do item, delete mapping also. We have get all to do items, which is a get mapping endpoint, and we have update to do item, which is a put mapping endpoint. I have defined this endpoint so we can start applying some OpenAPI specification to it. And we have one data model, which is to do item. And we use this data model, for example, when we request body, when the endpoint request body. So actually, basically, you want to send a request to this endpoint with a request body as a data model in order to, for example, in here, in order to update a certain object or certain database entry. So we have only one database model. This is the main class of the Spring Boot application. The first thing to do, I'm gonna run this application and see what we have. As I said, we have a crude endpoint API example. I have prepared some collection on Postman, this just for testing purposes. We're gonna need it at the start, but once we apply the OpenAPI identification, we're gonna start to use Swagger in it. So now, if you can see here, I have the first one on a Swagger crash course, which is the create. Our application is running. If I send to localhost /8080 /to-do, I will get response. It's fake data, as we said, but we just put it for the testing purposes. And if I send put a request to the update, I will also get some response, get all the same. I will get some list of JSON object and get by ID. It's a crude example, and we have delete at the end. So basically now we have a working operational Spring Boot application with a couple of routers. The first thing to do if we want to start to use OpenAPI specification and Swagger is to add the OpenAPI doc dependency to the POM.xml. We can do that by going to maven OpenAPI doc, and we can go open the maven repository.com, and we can see here the last version is 1.6.4. We can copy the dependency and we add it to the POM.xml file in the dependency tag section. Now, if we refresh and rerun the project, now we will have out of the box a Swagger user interface, and we can access it by going to localhost, whatever port that you use, /swagger-ui/index.html. Now, if I open it, you can see I have a user interface out of the box. This definition has read all the endpoints that I have, but as you can see, it's like it has a weird naming, and we need to start specify a couple of things in order to make this document viable. For sure, as a Swagger interface, it gives you a lot of functionality to your project. We can, for example, test each one of this. We used Postman at the start to send request. Using the Swagger user interface, you can do that here out of the box. For example, here I'm gonna send to get to do item any request, and I'm gonna say execute, and you can see that I'm having the same response. So basically now I have my own user interface to test my own endpoints inside this API. So, as I said, you can see that the naming is not like correct. We need to start to customize this user interface, and we need to start to see the section of this Swagger user interface. First, at the sections of this user interface, we have the search button over there. You can search if you have a lot of endpoints in here and you need to search for a specific one, you can search for it here. After that, we have the project title, which here in this case here, it's OpenAPI definition. For sure, we're going to change it. We have the version of the project. And this is a green box here, determine which OpenAPI specification version that we are using. In this case, we are using OpenAPI specification version 3. Under that, you can see there's a small link, which is, this is the link for the actual OpenAPI specification document JSON file. You can take this JSON file and apply it on multiple tools to build API. We're gonna see some application for this the document. After this section, we have the servers section, which include all the servers that you're using. In our cases now, we have only one server because we are using only locally on the local host. But for example, if you are running your project on cloud, also you can have another server in here, and you can like switch between them in order to test and in order also to identify all the endpoints that you have, if it's working or not. After that, in this section, we have the actual endpoints here, and each one of these endpoints, as you can see, has its own title, and this doesn't make sense. Also, we're gonna use tags to fix this one. After that, this is the method type in the endpoint. For example, this is the get to do item by ID endpoint. It's using the get, and this is the URL for this endpoint. So it's whatever host that you're using /to do item ID, which is a path variable ID. After that, we have the parameters in here and responses section. In the bottom parameters, if you try to try out, you can see that you can put whatever variable that you want in here, and you can execute it, and you can do a clear. In the responses section, you can see that we have an example of CURL sending method from the CMD. If you want to use it, you can copy and paste. For example, if we open a CMD and we take this as this URL command and apply it, we can get out of the box response. After that, the request URL is in total after you execute it, and the server response in here as a code and details. So this is basically the whole thing. At the end of the section of this user interface, Swagger user interface, you see the schemas or the data models. In our case, we have only one data model, which is to do item, as I show you. And it's basically a Bujo class, which has a couple of attributes and structure, constructor. This is like here. If you have any other data models used inside of it, you can see it in this section. So let's start to customize this user interface, and let's start to add some OpenAPI definition to our project in order to describe the whole API. The first thing we're gonna do is changing the project name here and changing the version. And we can do that by going to our main class, which is, let me close this one first, which is the Swagger, the runner class. And under the Spring Boot application, you will add OpenAPI definition. This is the first annotation of OpenAPI or Swagger inside your project. What we can add here, one thing to mention, any of this annotation, if you hit command and after that you press the mouse click, you can enter inside the interface itself or inside the annotation itself, and you can see what is the available attributes and values that you can use. In our example here, we have the OpenAPI definition interface. We have inside of it an info attributes, we have tag attributes, servers, security requirement. So basically, each one of this one, you can access it by just hitting command on Mac or control on a PC, and you can access this attributes inside, so you can check all the lists inside. We're gonna focus on this course only on the basics because it's a crash course, and we're not gonna like do in details one by one of these attributes. So as we said, OpenAPI definition, we open brackets. The first thing we can define is info tag, and this is in the info, the same in here. And inside this info, this will take at info interface or annotation. Inside this info, we can define the title first, which is gonna be, and for in our case here, let's say call it to do project, to do items project, for example, or API. We can also add the version inside after the comma, and version, let's put, for example, 1.0.0. Now let's try to run the project and see what we got in here. If we refresh, you can see now we have changed the project name and we have set a version for our specification. All those changes will be reflected inside, as we said, the JSON file of the Open specification itself. So here now we have OpenAPI Specification 3.0.0. We have the info tag of the project, which we define, the title, to do item API, and version 1.0.0. This is the first thing to do. Next, we want to define some of the global servers. As we said, now we are working only on one server, but what if you have another copy of this project or another clone of this project running on some container based in the cloud, and you want to also test those endpoints after the pipeline is executed. So to do that, we're going to add also inside the OpenAPI definition. Let me take some lines, new lines here, in order to separate things and make it more clear. We can here say servers, and if we check inside the servers, you can see it takes a server array which has an interface of a server annotation with the URL and description and some variables if you want to define any variables, and extension. So I'm gonna use at. First, I'm gonna open curly brackets to determine that it's gonna be an array, and a couple of those items gonna sit inside this tag. And I'm gonna open the first one, which is at server annotation. Inside this, I'm gonna put the URL. In our case here, the first one is the local host, which we're using right now. It's gonna be localhost 8080. And we're gonna add another one, which is gonna be anything. Let's put, for example, here my domain, and we can say, sorry, at server URL, we can say http 101.com. Now, if we rerun the project, you can see now we have two servers, localhost 8080 and 101. Now, because we're on default localhost, if we try to execute, we're gonna get some result because our project is already running. But for example, there's no project version running on this 101.com. If I choose it right now and I try out again, I'm gonna get some errors because it's failed to fetch and possible reason course or network failure. This is because this API is not exist. So here how you can define global servers. Although, worth to mention, you can always override those global servers in each one of this endpoint. For example, if you have one endpoint that use only one server, you can override this one here by using the operation tag. So this is the at OpenAPI definition tag in the main class. Okay, moving forward now, let's start describing our endpoint one by one. And I'm gonna focus on one endpoint, which is gonna be the update to do item, because this one has all the properties that we wanna define, and it's also include most of the things that we wanna discuss inside this crash course. So as we said, we have 5 endpoints. We're gonna start at the first by defining some tags. As you can see, each one of this endpoint has its own tag or on our own category, let's call it. And it doesn't make sense because all of those endpoints belonging to the to-dos, and it all working with one data model. So it makes more sense if we have all of those endpoints inside one tag only. And we can do that by always using the @ operation. This is a wrapper. This wrapper is Swagger 3 wrapper, and we use it now. Before that, we used to use each tag separately. For example, if we want one tag, we can put it outside. This is still working, but it's gonna be deprecated after a while. It's better now if you wanna describe your endpoint, you always start with one big wrapper class, let's call it, or wrapper interface, which is gonna be operation. Inside this operation, everything will be inside of it. So actually anything we wanna define to describe this endpoint, it will be inside the operation. So now we can define tags, and if we see inside this operation, we have a lot of attributes. Now we are talking about the tags attribute, which is gonna be this one. It's a string array. So basically we open a curly brackets and we can add tags. It's array because each one of this endpoint can have more than one tag or one category. So it's not only a single category. Now I'm gonna put to-do item as or to-do items here as our first tag. If I refresh now, you can see now I have to-do items tag. Okay, I want to put everything, all the other endpoints inside this tag. So I'm gonna copy and paste the whole operation tag in here, all endpoints, and here, and also here. And for sure, you can see we manual writing the name of this tag, but you always can use application.properties to set some the variable which is gonna be a global. So now, if I rerun the project again, you will see we have all the endpoints under the to-do items, which is better and make more sense. And as we said, each endpoint can have multiple tags. So for example, if I want this one put to appear in 2 places, I can add, let me go to the update. I can add another tag in here, which is gonna be, let's call it to-do items 2. Now, this endpoint will appear in 2 places. You can see to-do items, the same one here, and the same look on the inside this tag. And we can also add some description for these tags if we want, but this is not gonna be from the @operation tag. This is gonna be from the main class, and we can get inside the OpenAPI definition, open comma here, and we have the tags array, which will take a tag, for example. And inside this one, we'll take the name. This name should correspond to the tag name which you defined before. So if you want to put some description for to-do items, it should be to-do items. After that, we can have a description. This is the to-do items description. Now, if I refresh again, you can see now we have a description for it. So this is the tags. Moving forward, the next thing we're gonna do to describe our endpoint is start putting some tags inside the @operation so we can have more description for this endpoint. We can put an operation ID as a start, and this is for referencing purposes. Maybe you have some callbacks, you have some other endpoints to communicate with this one. So you define a unique operation ID for this one, and you can use it in the future. It's out of scope of this course, but you have this property here to be defined. And I'm gonna define it here, and let's say the operation ID is gonna be update to do. We can also add a description, we have two sections actually for the description. We have the summary will appear in here, and the description will appear under the title of this endpoint. So if we said summary, this is the summary, and if we said description, now if I refresh and rerun the project, you can see in our endpoint we have now, this is the summary and this is the description. You can here start to describe what this endpoint do. Now if we want to study this endpoint, you can see that we have a couple of things in this endpoint. First, as a request, this endpoint required a path variable, which is this one, to do item ID, and this also needs a cookie, which is can edit a cookie value, cookie parameters, and it has also a header, which is called from host, and it has is client inside the query, which the query we mean by that everything comes after the question mark in the URL. So basically, in order for this request to be fulfilled, if you want to send to this endpoint, you need to provide a path variable, you need to provide a cookie, and you need to provide a header and the query. And I put everything inside this endpoint so we can start to describe one by one, and we can see how we can do that. And the request body section is where you send your form information or details. For example, if this endpoint is responsible to update a certain object, you're gonna put the object here in the request body. It can be JSON. JSON is the must uses the used request body, so stay with JSON. And you can see the schema here. And this is, as you can see, the Swagger and the user interface read this one out of the box. We didn't define anything, but because we have here in this endpoint the annotation at request body, and we bind it to the to-do item model, so Swagger automatically knows that this is the data model that we are using, and it's gonna be the request body in here. And this is a very good thing in this user interface, because now if we want to try this one, we just need to add some, fill some data fields. And as you can see, it also give us the request body as a JSON object. We just need to hit execute and everything's gonna work. Moving forward, let's start first to describe our request body. We can have some description for this request body. We can even change the schema of this request body for any reason. And we can do that by using first inside the operation. As I said, everything is gonna go inside the operation wrapper. So we put comma and we say here the request body, and now we can start to define the request body. And if we open it here, you can see the request body will take a request body interface or annotation, which will take description, content, and if it's required or not. So at request body. And here we have to be careful with one thing. This is like a common mistake when you start using Swagger or OpenAPIDefinition. As a request body, we have two libraries, the original library from Spring Framework and the Swagger library. In this annotation, it's okay to use the Spring Framework original annotation. But when you define the request body in here, you have to use the Swagger one. This makes some problems, and you can find this answers on Stack Overflow. So here, now we import this one. We can say inside the request body, first we can put some description. This is the request body description, for example. Now, if I rerun and refresh in here, you can see now we have some description for our request body. We can also define the content. As you can see here, out of the box, as I said, Swagger has already defined the content of this request body. But if for any reason you want to change this content, we can do that by doing that inside the request body. You can see we're still inside the brackets of request body. We do comma. I'm gonna have a new line here so I can start writing. And here I can say content. Inside this content, I can take the @content interface also. Inside this one, I can say the schema is gonna be at schema also. And in order to change this one, we only have now one data model. I'm gonna insert a new data model just for testing purposes. Let's call it customer. It's gonna be simple. Let's put only one variable inside of it, or one attribute, string customer ID. And let's do some constructor here. So this can be read as a data model. For sure, you always can use a helping library like Lombok. Lombok is great for these things, but now it's out of the scope of this course. So now we have another data model. Now, as I said, if I want to change the content model here or the schema, I can say at here implementation is equal to customer.class. Now, if we rerun, you can see that now the request body has a different schema, which is customer ID. And as I said, it doesn't make sense to change it, but I'm only showing you how you can do that. So this is the request body tag. The next attribute we're gonna do now is starting defining our parameters. As we said here, we have a couple of parameters in here. In this case, path variable, cookie value, request header, and request parameter. The only exception is at request body. As you can see, the request body has its own attribute here to be defined, but all other of these parameters can be used with only one attribute, which is parameters. So parameters can include the description of all of this different kind of, let's call it inputs. So now I'm gonna start by defining the path, or by putting some description for this one, which is the path variable to do item. And we can do that always by using one thing is at parameters, at parameter interface, open brackets, and inside a parameter interface, we have to define the name. The name should correspond to the same name in here, so the description will be matched. Otherwise, you will have a problem. And I'm gonna take it, copy and paste. After we define the name now, we are binding this parameter to the other one. We can set a description and we can set an example. So description in here, this is like I'm gonna put the path variable. And as we said, we can put example for what the input is gonna be. For example, as we have to do item ID, let's put 554. I didn't put example in here, and 554. Now, if we rerun again, you can see now we have a description for this parameter, which is the path variable, an example of what's gonna be. And if you want to try out, the example will be filled automatically here. So all you have to do is put some examples and you can start using this endpoint. This is, as I said, inside the parameters array, and it's going to correspond to all of those things. Let me show you something inside of this one at parameters. You can also define something called in. It doesn't make sense to change the place of this parameters because you already defined it in Spring Boot as the path variable, and the Swagger already know it, but also I'm going to show you if you want to change the place of this parameter, for example, from path variable to a request header or cookie value, you can do that by doing in, which will take parameters in enum, for example. And let me show you what is parameters in enum. It will have values header, query, path, and cookie. Now, as we said, it's inside the .path, and it doesn't make sense to change it, but if you want to change it for any reason, this is how you can change the place of this parameters. Once you change it here, it's going to be reflected inside the body. For the other parameters in here, it's gonna be the same process. So basically copy and paste, change the name, put some description as you want, and put some example for it. Okay, moving forward, the next attribute is hidden attribute. For any reason, sometimes you wanna hide the whole endpoint from your user interface, and you can do that by using hidden, and it's Boolean value, so you can set it to true. It's by default false. If you set it to true, your endpoint will be disappeared right now from the user interface in here. You can see it's disappeared. So let's remove it because we are using this endpoint. The next thing we can define now is the external documents. Sometimes you will have some description for your endpoint in this user interface, but also you will have documentation, maybe more extended documentation in other place. So you can define an external documentation which gonna be an external link for your documentation. And you can do that by using external docs attribute, and this one will take an external documentation interface. So we can do at external documentation, and inside external documentation we can define the URL for this documentation. Let's give it, for example, here 101.com/docs. And also, if you want, you can put other things like description and extensions. Let's put description in here. Let's say for more details, check the link. Now, if we refresh again, you can see now we have find more details. For more details, check the links, and if you press it, it will take you to the external doc. Okay, moving forward. The next thing we can describe is the responses. As you see, now we almost described the whole request thing, like we had described what kind of attributes and what kind of parameters this request required in order to function properly. We described the request body, we changed the type of this request body. Now we can also describe what kind of responses that we are expected. As you know, the HTTP responses code, 200 means successful, 400 mean bad request, 404 mean it's not found. We can describe all of this in here. So how we can do that? It's also inside at operation wrappers. As I say, everything goes inside at operation wrappers. And we will have a responses attribute array. This responses attribute array, it will take at ABI response user interface. Inside this one, we can define first the response code, which in my case now, I'm going to define the first response, which is the successful response, and it's going to be 200. Inside this one, we can also define the content of the response itself. And in our cases, I'm going to say that the response of this ABI is going to be the same example, the same request body that we used. So basically, if we send an JSON object here, it will it's gonna be like published also in here, because as you can see, I'm taking the request body and I'm sending it again. So because we changed the schema when we start to describe the request body, I'm gonna remove this one here so we can get back to our original schema, or I can put the schema in here. Let me put the schema once more time. Okay, now I'm gonna remove the content just to check again and see what's happened. Now we are back to the original schema, which is the request body, as you can see, to do item model. So I'm gonna expect the same response here. You can see now, because we didn't describe it, we don't have the same response in here. So as we said, the response code is 200. We can define the content, and I'm gonna do content at content as we did before. At the scheme is gonna be at schema, and the implementation will be from the to-do item as we did before. Now, if I rerun again, you can see now we have the response code 200, which is successful, and we will get this one as an example of the value that we can come. We can also put some description. Succeeds response, for example. You can see now we have this is succeeds response as a description. We can also define that the output will be in certain media type. As you can see here, we have the wildcard, which is going to be anything. We can do what we can do. We can say in here inside the schema tag, let's take it here. We can say inside the schema that the media type will be media type, and this is enum from a framework, and this is, you can see the media type. We have JSON, we have other like form, URL encoded value, etc. So the media type in here is going to be JSON. Now we are defining that the output will be in JSON format when this response code 200 is successfully done. So let's refresh. Now you see that the media type is application.json. If you have a couple of responses variable here, for example, because we can only define one API response for each status code like 200 in here, and maybe there are some cases where sometimes you will have this as a response and another maybe data model as a response. It doesn't make sense, but I'm going to show you, as I said, how you can do it. You can put inside the add content scheme, add content interface, example, which is array. This array will take an example object, and so let's open curly brackets. Let's say example object, and this example object will take name and value. Let's put name and value in here, and let's see what's going to happen. So name succeeds 1, let's call it, and value is going to be object, for example. And let's put another one. Succeeds 2, and value, for example, maybe it will be string. If we refresh again, you can see now under the 200 status code, we have example 1 and example 2. If we change between example 1 and example 2, we will have a different value in here. So this is how we define API responses. Now, getting to the last and important thing here, which is the authentication. We haven't spoke about any authentication until so far. Now, your API endpoint will sure use some kind of authentication, maybe HTTP basic, maybe bearer token, maybe OAuth flow, I don't know. You can define this one by doing two things. First, you can define the global authentication in which the project will be used, and you can see it as a description. And you can, after that, say at each endpoint which authentication system this endpoint will use. So it's an endpoint specification, but you defined it on the global term. To describe this more, let's start by going to the main class, and we want to define a security schema. So we use add security schema. Inside the security schema, we will have first the name. And this name is, you can choose whatever name you want, but choose something, describe which one you use. In my case here, I'm going to use the bearer token authentication system with GWT. So I'm going to name it here, bearer GWT. As I said, you can name it wherever you want. This is required. Now we have the name for the schema. We should define also the type. The type should be a security schema enum. And if we open the security schema enum here, we can see that we have API key, we have HTTP, we have OpenAPI connect, and we have OAuth 2. In our case, we're going to use the HTTP. So dot HTTP. Now we define the type. We should define the schema. The schema in this case is going to be bearer. And as you know, the bearer token is inside the header. So it doesn't no need to define this one, but if you want to change it for any reason, you can use in, as we said, parameter in before. dot, maybe this now, your bearer token is inside the cookie, maybe it's inside a query, for any reason. If you want to change it, how you can, this is how you can change it here. We can keep it at default in header, so I'm not going to define that. After that, we need to set the bearer format, and in our cases, the bearer format is going to be GWT, use it all capital, and I'm going to put here, let me take a new line, I'm going to put here some description, which is bearer token for the project. Now we define the security scheme. If we rerun the project now, as you can see now, before I refresh here, we don't have any authorization system, and we don't have any indication that we have any authorization system inside this project. Now, if I refresh again, you can see now we have this here as authorized. If we press on it, you will see that it's bearer GWT, as I defined the name in here, and this is the description I added, and this is the type. It's HTTP bearer. We even can put some value here to be used. So far, as I said, we defined the global authorization system, but not even one of those endpoints are using it. So because sometimes you will have public endpoints and you will have a private endpoints, so that makes sense that it's endpoint specific identification and not like definition, sorry, and not like a global. So for example, now I'm gonna say that this put endpoint should use the bearer authentication, and I can define that by going to the same endpoint here, which is update to do item, and it's also inside the @operation tag. I will take comma, and I will say security. Inside the security here, you can see it takes a security requirement, and this is an array. Sometimes you will have more than one secure authentication system or security system in your project, and you can define the couple, and you can use it, a couple of those authentication in each endpoint. So getting back to our endpoint, I'm gonna say here it's at first it's an array, and it will take a security requirement. Inside this security requirement, we should define the name. The name should correspond to the name of the security scheme that you want to use. In our case here, we set the name for bearer GWT. So if you want your endpoint to use this one, it should be the same name. So bearer GWT. Now, if I rerun the project, you can see here there is nothing or any indication that this endpoint are using this authorization. If I refresh now, we have the lock icon here, which determined that this endpoint need or required an authentication. And if you want to use it, you can put, for example, if you have any authentication system, we didn't install an authentication system because it's out of the scope of this course. But if you already set one and you have now the bearer token, which is going to be something like that, for example, you can add it here and set authorized. Now, every time you want to try out this endpoint, the value which be set here will be sent inside the header authentication. So this is how you define an OpenAPI specification. This is how you describe your endpoint inside Swagger, a Spring Boot, or OpenAPI document project. Now, as we promised in the first of the course, we will see some of the application, how we can benefit from the JSON file, which is the Open Specification JSON file. As we said, we can access the Open Specification document by hitting the link in here. Now, this is the JSON file. We can do a file and we can do save page as, and I'm gonna put it as API documentation. It's gonna be .json file. Now we have this documentation JSON file, which is agnostic of any programming language. So the first benefit is we can use this one with the Swagger code generation to generate some boilerplate code and also to preview the API itself. And we can do that by going to Google and say Swagger code gen. You can see we will get to the code generator, and from swagger.io, we go to editor and we press live demo. Here, as you can see, we have already the code generation. If you make import file and you do this one, now you have your file in here. The best thing, the first good thing here, that you can, if you, for example, having a meeting with any client and you don't have your project with you and you want to show the result of your documentation for the client or maybe other part of the team without having a fully Spring Boot application running, you can use the editor here in the code generation in swagger.io to preview your Swagger documentation. This is a fully functional. You can use it, you can try it out, and this is a very good thing. Also, you can use the servers is as you defined it in here. This is the first benefit. The second one, as we said, this documentation is an agnostic of any which programming language that you use. You can see we built it using Spring Boot and Java. But what if for any reason you want to change the programming language of your API and maybe use, for example, Node.js with Express? This is also the good thing. Once you have the JSON file, we can use the swagger.io and we can generate a server. This is going to generate for us a boilerplate code project out of the box for whatever programming language that you want. In my case here, I want it for a Node.js server. Now, as you see, it generated file. If I open it and unzip it and get inside, now I have a Node.js folder project with Express, and I have the same controllers and same functionality as my API here with the click of the button. Now you can tweak some maybe of the properties inside, but now with a click of button, you have another programming language project for your API. This is a very cool thing if you think about it. Also, we built a server and we built a Node.js here with Express as a server, as a backend. But you can also use this OpenAPI specification to generate a client, a front end. For example, an Angular front end to consume your API in here. And you can do that by also generate client. In my case here, I'm going to generate TypeScript Angular. And if I open it and unzip it, you can see that we have a fully functional Angular project with also a boilerplate code. We have the models in here. We have APIs which will have the routing inside of it for each one of the endpoint that we already defined in our API. So this is the first application, or the mini application with the swagger.io, which is very great and which gives you a lot of things to do. The next application that we're gonna preview is that you can use this JSON file with the Postman, and you can create the whole API and whole documentation inside Postman for guys who like to work with the Postman. And just like by feeding this JSON file to the system over there. So opening Postman, we can do that by hitting File, Import, and feed the JSON file to Postman. As you can see, Postman identified this project as OpenAPI 3.0, and this is the project name, and it will create a whole API and whole documentation for it. I'm going to press Import. And now you can see inside the API we have to do items API, and we have a definition, full definition for an API. Also as JSON, we have a documentation built by Postman out of the box. Also, we can also use the code generation of Postman to do the same as we said we do with the swagger.io. So the sky is the limit, actually. You can use a lot of API tools. You can even mock services here. You can do whatever you want with this JSON file. So this is a great tool, actually. And you will see also in the collection, Postman out of the box also create a to-do item API for us, which has all the get and post and delete things that we already did. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching. If you find this information useful, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Thanks and bye-bye.